Good evening. I am Terry Darell Caldwell. For the past several years, I have been building a case. 7 books of nonfiction, 7 books of fiction, dozens of speeches, hundreds of pages of footnotes, thousands of citations. Tonight, I am not here to present that evidence, not all of it. I am here to do something simpler and something far more dangerous. I am here to ask a single question. Prove it. Prove that race is real. Prove that the categories on the census form correspond to something in nature. Prove that the boxes you check, white, black, Asian, Native American, Middle Eastern, Northern African, Hispanic, have any biological, scientific, or even consistent legal meaning. Prove it. Because I have read the evidence. I have followed the footnotes. I have traced the chain of custody from Linnaeus to the Office of Management and Budget. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, the prosecution has a case. The defense has none. Tonight, I am not going to prove that race is a fiction. I am going to do something more fundamental. I am going to shift the burden of proof. From now on, the defenders of racial classification must answer a simple question. Where is your evidence? And they have none. There is a line from a film, a dark film, a film about power and corruption. The character, Alonzo, a detective who has traded his badge for a crown of thorns, says to a rookie, "It's not what you know, it's what you can prove." That line is the thesis of this entire project, because what I know, what I have known since I was a child, reading encyclopedias at 5 years old, is that race is a lie. What I know is that the boxes do not fit. What I know is that the system is built on a foundation of sand. But knowing is not enough. I cannot change the law with knowing. I cannot change the census with knowing. I cannot change the clinical algorithms, the redistricting maps, the affirmative action quotas, the hate crime statistics, the federal funding formulas. None of it with knowing. I can only change it with proof. And tonight, I am going to show you that I have the proof, and I am going to demand that the defenders of the fiction produce theirs. Let us begin. The first question: is race biologically real? If you believe it is, prove it. The defense might point to skin color. Look, they say, people look different. There are white people and black people and brown people. That is race. But skin color is not race. Skin color is a sunscreen. It is a biological adaptation to ultraviolet radiation. The Fitzpatrick scale, which medical professionals use to assess sunburn risk, has 6 categories. 6. That is a spectrum, not a set of races. And the difference between type 1 and type 6 is governed by a handful of genes. Genes that are ancient, shared across the species, and continuously distributed across geography. Skin color is a climb, not a category. It is a gradient, not a box. Prove it is not. The defense might point to genetics. Look, they say, we can cluster people by continental ancestry. There are clusters: European, African, Asian. That is race. But clusters are mathematical artifacts. They are the result of algorithms that are told how many clusters to find. If you tell the algorithm to find 5 clusters, it will find 5. If you tell it to find 7, it will find 7. If you tell it to find 12, it will find 12. And even then, the clusters overlap. In 1972, geneticist Richard Lewontin demonstrated that approximately 93% of all human genetic variation exists within so-called racial groups, not between them. Modern whole genome sequencing has tightened that number, 93 to 95%. Two people from opposite sides of the planet are, on average, genetically more similar to each other than two people from the same race. Prove otherwise. The defense might point to disease. Look, they say, sickle cell anemia is a black disease. Cystic fibrosis is a white disease. That is race. But sickle cell trait is found in malaria zones across sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, India, and the Mediterranean. It is not found in all black people, only in those whose ancestors lived in malaria zones. Cystic fibrosis is most common in Northern European populations, but it appears elsewhere. These are not racial diseases. They are local adaptations and founder effects. Prove otherwise. The defense has no answer. Not because they are stupid, because the evidence is not there. Race is not biology. It was never biology. It was a social fiction invented to justify slavery and colonization. It has been maintained by administrative inertia, not by science. If race is biology, prove it. If you cannot prove it, admit it. That is the first burden. The second question is race historically stable? If you believe it is, prove it. The defense might point to ancient civilizations. Look, they say, the Egyptians distinguished between Nubians and Libyans. The Greeks distinguished between Hellenes and Barbaroi. That is race. But those distinctions were cultural, linguistic, and political, not biological. A Nubian could become a pharaoh. A Gaul could become a Roman senator. A barbarian could Hellenize. The boundaries were porous. Race, as we understand it, was invented between 1758 and 1920. Linnaeus, Kant, Blumenbach, Morton, Cuvier, Gobineau, Grant, Stoddard. I have named them in my books. Their work was deliberate, fraudulent, and self-serving. Prove otherwise. The defense might point to the Nazi racial laws. Look, they say, Nazis define race. That was race. But the Nazis changed their definitions when it served them. In 1936, they declared the Japanese to be honorary Aryans, not because of science, but because of a treaty. 1 year, the Japanese were subhuman. The next year, they were honorary whites. The same people, the same biology, a different diplomatic calculation. Race is a diplomatic tool. Prove otherwise. The defense may point to the United States Census. Look, they say, the census has been asking about race since 1790. That is tradition. But tradition is not evidence. The census categories have changed every decade. In 1890, there were categories for mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon. In 1930, there was a category for Mexican that disappeared in 1940. In 1977, there were 4 racial categories. In 1997, there were 5, plus a separate Hispanic ethnicity question. In 2024, there is a new MENA category. The same government that tells you race is stable changes the definitions every generation. Prove the categories correspond to anything real. Prove that the 1977 categories were real, and the 2024 categories are also real, even though they are different. Prove it. You cannot, because the categories are not stable. They are not consistent. They are not real. They are administrative convenience. Prove otherwise. The third question: is race legally defined? If you believe it is, prove it. The defense might point to the Civil Rights Act. Look, they say, the law prohibits discrimination on the basis of race. That is a legal definition. But the Civil Rights Act does not define race. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, but it never defines any of those terms. The Voting Rights Act does not define race. The Census Act does not define race. The Fair Housing Act does not define race. The Equal Protection Clause does not define race. Congress has never defined what race means. The defense might point to OMB Directive 15. Look, they say, the Office of Management and Budget defines the categories. That is the legal definition. But Directive 15 is an administrative directive, not a statute. It was issued under the Paperwork Reduction Act, a statute about paperwork, not about biology, not about justice, not about identity. And Directive 15 itself admits these categories are social political constructs and should not be interpreted as being scientific or anthropological in nature. The government itself admits the categories are not real. Prove otherwise. The defense might point to the courts. Look, they say, the Supreme Court has upheld race-based remedies. That is a legal definition. But the courts have never ruled on the constitutionality of OMB Directive 15 itself. They have applied strict scrutiny to affirmative action, to redistricting, to set-asides, but they have never asked, does the government have the authority to classify every citizen by race? The question is open. The case has never been fully argued. If the system is constitutional, prove it. Prove that the Paperwork Reduction Act gives OMB the power to define the racial identity of every American. Prove that the courts have upheld this, not just assumed it. Prove it. You cannot, because the system has never been challenged. Not because it is constitutional, but because no one has had the standing or the will to challenge it. That ends tonight. The fourth question: is race politically neutral? If you believe it is, prove it. The defense might point to civil rights. Look, they say, race data are necessary to enforce civil rights. That is neutral. But race data are not neutral. They are the raw material for political redlining. The Gingell's test requires majority-minority districts. It requires racial cohesion. It requires racial voting. Political parties pack minority voters into one district and bleach the surrounding districts. The result is a landscape of hyper-segregated, non-competitive elections and a permanent incentive for racial polarization. Prove that this is neutral. Prove that the system does not manufacture racial cohesion. The defense might point to health disparities. Look, they say, race data are necessary to measure health disparities. That is neutral. But race data produce junk correlations. Clinical algorithms that use EGFR, PFTs, VBAC, calculators have harmed patients for decades. The NIH mandate produces correlations that cannot be acted upon safely. Prove that race data improve health outcomes. Prove that they do not harm patients. Prove it. The defense has no answer, not because they are wrong, but because they have never been asked to prove it. The burden has always been on the critics. The burden has always been on the reformers. The burden has always been on the abolitionists. Tonight, that changes. The great white shark does not attack from the surface. It rises from the deep, dark water, patient, silent, invisible. It converts depth into velocity. It strikes from below. The seal does not see it coming. When the shark breaches, it and the seal leave the water together, rising above the surface in a single explosive moment. Only one body returns to the water alive. That is what this speech is. The evidence has been accumulating for years. It has been sinking into the depths, unseen, unheard, ignored. Tonight, it breaches. The truth is the shark. Justice is the color of its belly. When the shark breaches, its belly is white, the color of the surface, the color of the sun, the color of the killing blow. It is the color of what is right. It is the color of what is inevitable. The defenders of the fiction have been swimming on the surface, believing they are safe. They have not seen the shadow rising from below. They have not felt the shift in the water. But the breach is coming. It is already here. It is not what I know. It is what I can prove. And I have proved it. I have proved that race is not biology. I have proved that race is not historically stable. I have proved that race is not legally defined. I have proved that race is not politically neutral. I have proved that the burden of proof belongs to the defenders of the fiction. Now it is their turn. Let them prove that the boxes correspond to something real. Let them prove that OMB Directive 15 is constitutional. Let them prove that race data do not harm patients. Let them prove that the Gingell's test does not manufacture racial cohesion. Let them try. If they cannot prove it, or if they can prove it, if they can produce a single piece of evidence that meets the standard of a court of law, I will concede. But they cannot, because the evidence does not exist, because the fiction is not real, because the system is a lie, and the truth is a shark. The water is rising. The breach is coming. Justice is the color of its belly. Court is adjourned.